Alright, time for another draftphysics.com video presentation. So one of the videos on interesting subjects that physics kind of ignored, or you would think physicists would have paid some attention to. I'll have to fix that. Alright, is the speed of light, because it's really the speed of force, and that's how it should be understood, because everything, travels, moves. Yeah, close enough. Force. Anyway, so everything travels at this speed. So if I'm going to have an interaction between just two charges, I'm going to have an interaction that's going to take place at the speed of force. This won't know what this is doing electrically charged until it goes this speed. So, at small distances with charges, but that's the fact. The fact is that the stuff that, we can put energy in, into a matter, and we can produce light. We can put heat in, essentially, and produce light. And we know that one goes the speed of light, the speed of force. And then gravity is another one. They've kind of figured it out, that the relationship between Earth and the Moon, or all the other objects, the Sun and the Earth, it's all at the speed of light. It takes the time of the speed of light for it to travel. So gravitational waves, for example, if they were real, they're moving the same speed as photons. So this is the big one where everything goes wrong, because they have this idea of bent space. So they've cut this part of the universe off and said this is completely different, where there's some hope that you can connect these three: magnetism, electricity, and light. Obviously, the connection between electricity and light is really very solid. And the connection to magnetism is the same, again, the same speed. But what is the phenomenon made out of? Now, what I would say is, once you've accepted that, yes, it's the speed of force, all the things, going exceptionally fast that are immaterial, gravity, immaterial, the forces affecting magnets, immaterial as far as we can tell. It's not electrons flying and hitting things. And obviously the stuff between two charges is not, can't be an electron, because an electron is one of the charges. So that has to be something that we could call, if not immaterial, so discrete, so tiny, that it might as well be, even though it carries momentum. So anyway, this is all connected. So Maxwell made these clear connections between electricity and magnetism and the speed, and then, later deduced that gravity's doing the same thing, and just makes it so logical that whatever you're going to explain all of these interactions with, it's going to be the same stuff. The idea that space would be bent, whatever that means, with a mechanism that has the same speed as the little discrete stuff that we kind of figure that light and magnets have to be using, seems pretty improbable on its face, that completely different mechanisms would be functioning at the same speed. So it just leads to a bunch of speculation about, well, maybe the interactions between electrons and protons are being created by some photon, by something that just is either creating pressure or not creating pressure differentially based on whether it's a positive or a negative. And again, the very fact that this electrical circumstance of having a positive and a negative creates a dipole, which is exactly what, magnets are completely made out of, are creating dipoles. So that connection is just kind of obvious. And it just leads you to one conclusion, that, well, what would be creating the gravity would be an external force. The Earth isn't doing anything. The Moon isn't doing something. They're not creating vacuum cleaner sounds. They're not sucking space. So whatever they're doing, they're in equilibrium with it. And so the explanation just has to be created where you can understand that equilibrium, that external pressure, can look like, obviously in the gravity case it's kind of simple, because you're just saying everything is pushed together. If there was an external pressure, it would do that. So if you create a system with a bunch of little energy bits flying around, you put two bigger objects in, they would be smashed together eventually. So gravity's kind of easy. The more complicated one is obviously magnetism. But once you're on this course, once you've concluded that whatever the mechanisms that are causing motion, they're all moving at the same incredibly fast speed, that it's a tiny discrete substance that's in the universe, and it has to have the energy. There's no energy. Again, the Earth isn't manufacturing energy. The charges aren't manufacturing energy to create light or create anything. Magnets clearly aren't manufacturing, constantly producing something. They're not like radioactive and they're losing mass. So there's no evidence that they're generating the force. The evidence is that whatever's outside them, okay, is going inside of them, and it's creating a change in that equilibrium. What goes in doesn't necessarily come out the same way, and that's the key point, I guess I would point out, is that you can sort of understand that maybe when electricity goes through a wire, okay, that there's two functions going on. Yeah, there's a bunch of electrons going through the wire, okay, and their drift speed is, bullshit. I mean, drift speed just means that you're not utilizing all the atoms, so 99% of the atoms aren't losing electrons. They're not moving anything. And so they're counting all of those electrons and then dividing that into this total speed. And obviously that's not the speed of the little tiny portion of the wire that's actually transmitting the electricity is a small portion of it. So there's no drift velocity, and it's not a real thing. The actual active parts of the conductor, it's moving very fast. It gets to, it gets from one end of the wire to the other end of the wire at least half the speed of light, if not much faster. So there's no such thing as drift velocity. It's not a real thing. Anyway, but what's happening in the wire? Well, what you're doing is you're taking these atoms and you're polarizing them. You're taking atoms that are neutral, that is, they're not dipoles in the circumstance, that is, their pluses and their minuses are arranged in such a way as that it all kind of balances out. And what you're doing when you shove electricity in is you break that balance and you end up creating sections that are more positive and sections that are more negative, and you polarize it. And that changes how energy hitting the surface is reflected. So you could argue that if this looks positive, then the energy, portions of the energy reflect, and if it looks negative, some other portion of the energy reflects. And what you're really seeing in the magnetic effect and the wire isn't that the wire is creating magnetism. It's that the wire is reflecting magnetically. It looks like a dipole. All right, it's creating a dipole. And a dipole, you can get into the complexity of it, but it's a specific kind of dipole, like a bullseye. And you can have a bullseye with a solid center and then a solid ring on the outside, or you could start with a hollow center and then the first ring is the solid ring and then a hollow ring. So you can have these two different variations of the same pattern, and those two variations could mean the difference between attraction and repulsion. So if two with the dark center meet, they repel each other. If a dark center meets a empty center, then those two would allow for attraction, because the external pressure will be greater than the internal pressure, because they won't create any internal pressure. So I have gone through a whole bunch of explanations how simple it would be just to have two kinds of force, the same as the plus and minus of the electron and the proton, a proton force and an electron force, and then the two objects just act inversely to those two forces. One force is inert to the other one, and the other force pushes it, and everything can be pretty well explained. But it's almost as if there's a complete vacuum of any physicist recognizing that the truth has to be somewhere in the environment, that it has to come from the outside. Magnets do things, and the only place for the energy to come from has to be the external environment. There's no place for it to come from. They can't perpetually make force. So the force has to be in the environment, and it certainly has to be in the environment. In the case of gravity, the Earth isn't constantly eating space, and the Moon isn't constantly eating space. I mean, the notions you have to come up with as explanations are just so implausible. And so I suppose this comes down to the idea that it is a push universe. Okay, and that's what I'm really arguing. But I really didn't want to make that just the subject. But it's tied to this subject. And that the truth is the universe has active force in it. It accounts for gravity, and it accounts for all the functions of charges and functions of the dipoles. And it's really that simple. These are the monopoles of magnetism, the electron, the proton. And you arrange them in a pattern, and they create magnetism. And it's really not nearly as complicated as their, 500 plus particles they've invented, antimatter, entanglement, superposition, and then bent space, which has no explanation at all. It doesn't fit with the rest of the universe's function, and it just ends up getting in the way of saying, well, there's a huge amount of energy obviously smashing things together in the universe, and you can't account for it. You can only account for it in an exchange sense, in the sense that something gets energy going in and something has to give away the energy going out. But that's the only way you account for it. You don't account for its function involved in any of the other functions that are part of the system. And I think it can be accounted for as the price you pay for moving electrons and protons. When you move an electron, you're taking a force going the speed of light, and you're pushing something with it. And when you push it, you have to spread that velocity over the entire object, and you end up with a velocity way lower than the speed of light. And that's the differential that creates gravity. So when you have matter, force hits it, pushes it, and in the case of spherical matter, it pushes it in the same amount in all directions, so it doesn't go anywhere, but it's still getting pushed. That's why it gets hot. And that heat is evidence of energy you're creating out of the force, and it's energy that isn't escaping. I mean, over time it's at equilibrium, but the fact is at any one moment it's very hot in the center, and you have to account for where the energy came from. And it comes from merely the fact that you're moving. Everything you're moving takes energy to move, and you're constantly moving it. And in the case inside the Earth, there's lots of friction, and so you can't get away with just saying I moved it, I pushed it 1 billion years ago and it's still moving. That's not happening inside the Earth. No, I think that's probably enough. And so till the next time and such.